Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and thank you for joining us for the Naval War College Foundation's 9th Newport Lecture Series presentation of the 2020 to 2021 academic year, thinking about great power competition. The fact that this is the 9th Newport Lecture Series, it must mean graduation is close. I'm George Lang, CEO of the Naval War College Foundation. It's my pleasure to welcome you this evening. I also want to thank Chairman Bilden, our esteemed Board of Trustees, our members, friends, and benefactors, as well as my staff for their continued support and commitment to the rewarding missions of the U.S. Naval War College and Naval War College Foundation. Enabled by our generous foundation members for more than half a century, the college is able to continue its innovative, cutting-edge research, teaching, and wargaming programs that sustain it as America's premier institution and standard bearer for professional military education. The Naval War College Foundation is proud to support the U.S. Naval War College and its core values of military preparedness, leader development, and statesmanship. Tonight's presentation is an example of the scholarly topics mid-grade and senior level officers of our joint and combined force teams are immersed in during their 10-month rigorous academic program at the Naval War College. I'm confident you will enjoy it. Before I continue, just a reminder that should a question come to you during the presentation, please submit it via the Q&A box, and I'll be happy to present it to our guest speaker during the Q&A session. As I like to say at the beginning of these presentations, this is an event that is typically hosted monthly during the academic year at the Naval Station Newport Officers Club, usually preceded by a 30-minute reception where guests can mingle with Naval War College Foundation staff and friends, and typically the guest speaker of the evening. However, since COVID-19 appeared on the horizon early last year, we've been bringing Newport Lecture Series presentations and many others hosted by the Foundation to you virtually. A benefit of this approach is the opportunity to interact with many of our members and friends from across the nation and around the world, not just with those in the local area. So we thank you for dialing in from afar. Now, to introduce you and welcome you to our distinguished guest speaker for tonight's presentation. Dr. Timothy Hoyt is a professor in the Strategy and Policy Department at the U.S. Naval War College, where he has taught in residence since 2002. Prior to that, he taught for the Security Studies program at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service, as well as teaching for the Naval War College Distance Education program at the Pentagon. He is currently the John Nicholas Brown Chair of Counterterrorism and is also the academic director and senior mentor for the Advanced Strategy program. Dr. Hoyt earned a Bachelor of Arts degree from Swarthmore College, double majoring in political science and history, and a Master of Arts degree and PhD from the Johns Hopkins University Paul H. Nitze School of Advanced International Studies. Ladies and gentlemen, without any further ado, please give a warm virtual welcome to Dr. Timothy Hoyt.
Good evening, and George, thank you for the kind introduction. I also would like to thank the Foundation for all that it does for the college. I know that the Foundation has contributed significantly to helping me with my own research and that of many of my colleagues. And as George mentioned, much of that research is cutting edge and policy focused, but some of it also is historical, dealing both with naval history and military history. And the Foundation's support for all of these endeavors is greatly appreciated by myself and all of my colleagues. I should say right away that the views that you will hear are those of myself alone and not those of the Naval War College, the U.S. Navy, or any other U.S. government organization. This is the deal that we make that allows me to speak freely and to exhibit my scholarship and academic work without appearing to represent the Navy. And what I'm going to talk about today, thinking about great power competition, is actually very policy focused. It is, in fact, now the fundamental issue behind which the Department of Defense and the Navy are considering the international environment. Now, I act as both a historian and as a political scientist and an international relations specialist. So what I'm going to present to you today is some other considerations about great power competition that may not be coming out as clearly in the public debate. Both history and political science can help inform our actions in great power competition, as well as potentially our policy and our future prospects. Now, the return of great powers As we see in the National Defense Strategy of 2018, the central challenge to US prosperity and security is the reemergence of long-term strategic competition by what the National Security Strategy classifies as revisionist powers. And it defines specifically China and Russia as great power competitors and argues that they want to shape a world consistent with their authoritarian model. And this will be a shaping function for the US national security community in the future. What is competition? Well, again, according to the National Security Strategy, it does not always mean hostility, nor does it inevitably lead to conflict, although no one should doubt our commitment to defend our interests. This is also important because frequently people equate great power competition with imminent war. And I would argue that that's probably not the right way to understand this. I'll get to that in just a moment. The policy implications, again, according to the National Security Strategy, rethink the policies of the past 2 decades, policies based on the assumption that engagement with rivals and their inclusion in international institutions and global commerce would turn them into benign actors and trustworthy partners. For the most part, this premise turned out to be false. And this certainly was the policy of the Trump administration, specifically with China in terms of re-examining our economic relations with China and using new tools in order to reshape that economic relationship, including tariffs. Now, I would argue that competition actually falls pretty much in the middle of a spectrum of great power relations as we view them in history. At the warmest end of that spectrum, the friendliest end, we have great power concert. And this happened in Europe after the fall of Napoleon from 1815 to 1848. All of the major great powers in Europe cooperated in like interest in order to maintain regional stability. And you see great power concert again in the period from 1920 to 1930 after the First World War, when all of the great powers do cooperate under the League of Nations and a number of treaties, including the Locarno Pact, that created an environment in which great power conflict was almost inconceivable because relationships were so warm between the great powers. Now, a slightly less warm, but still a very powerful set of conditions for great powers would be condominium or alliance. And this is especially the case when there are 2 leading powers. Sometimes they actually ally, or they cooperate so intensely that they might actually, for all practical purposes, be allying. We see this in the Peloponnesian War, which is one of the case studies that the Strategy and Policy Department focuses on. From 480 to 466, Sparta and Athens are allies. We see it in the Anglo-French competition, which I'll talk about a bit later, from 1726 to 1740, where again, Britain and France are allied with one another. And we see a near alliance relationship between Germany and Britain from 1885 to 1900 that both sides explored as potentially a binding alliance system and eventually rejected as interests began to vary in such extreme ways that an alliance was no longer possible. We also can see great power competition, cooperation, or détente, which we see again in the US-Soviet competition from 1970 to 1979. An attempt by Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon, and later President Ford and President Carter, to work with the Soviet Union and bring it into a US-led international system as a partner of some kind. And this failed after the invasion of Afghanistan, as we know, and the Cold War renewed. But competition then becomes something right in the middle of this spectrum. Beyond competition, things that are more difficult are confrontation or crisis, conflict between opposing coalitions, which we saw in Korea and Vietnam in the Cold War, and finally, at the extreme end, war between great powers, which I'll talk about in some detail. Now, the competition between China and the US has a lot of different analysts and viewpoints trying to vie for attention. And I've put up a number of different books here, which I think are all useful reads for those who are actually interested in studying this in greater detail. The first, Destined for War, by Graham Allison, has become a very hot book. He coined the idea of the Thucydides Trap, and it's actually a very interesting study of the rise of China and what it might mean for international relations and international security. And part of what he's talking about is war inevitable? And this is drawing on that quote from Thucydides: the growth of the power of Athens and the alarm this raised in Sparta made war inevitable. Now, Henry Kissinger's On China, which came out a few years earlier, is also a careful consideration of how to manage great power relations, and Kissinger focuses much more on the diplomatic angle and on international institutions. The books below, The 100-Year Marathon by Michael Pillsbury, is titled China's Secret Strategy to Replace America as the Global Superpower. This obviously lies on one end of the spectrum of analysis. Towards the other end is Michael Beckley's Unrivaled, which has the subtitle of How America Will Remain the Only Superpower. So there's a wide range of different writings that are coming out on US-China competition, and it's actually worth looking at across the spectrum in order to get a better view and understand all of the subtleties of this emerging competition. One of the reasons this is important is if you think war is inevitable, you can make very bad decisions. And here Karl von Clausewitz talks about this. Supposing a minor state is in conflict with a much more powerful one and expects its position to grow weaker every year. If war is unavoidable, should it not make the most of its opportunities before its position gets still worse? This is the thinking that led to Pearl Harbor. And Pearl Harbor turned out to be a disaster for the Japanese Empire. They boxed themselves intellectually and cognitively into a position where they felt that war against a stronger power, a war that they had very little chance of winning, was the best option available because they could not possibly choose other options. And that's a very scary place to be. And so when people talk about war with China being inevitable, I would immediately answer, no, only if you allow yourself to not think about alternatives. And one of the things that this lecture is intended to do is to bring up some of the other issues that we need to think about when we're thinking about great power competition with China. Now, the first is great power competition is a normal state of affairs. Historically, there have always been competing great powers and competing empires. And historically, they haven't been at war all the time. But this is very unfamiliar terrain for the United States, because for most of us, we think of history as post-1945. And in the post-1945 environment, first with the Cold War, which was dominated by just two powers, the United States and the Soviet Union, and then in the post-Cold War unipolar moment, where the United States had no major military competitor and only now an emerging economic competitor that we're considering threatening, the United States is used to playing the leading role in the international system and not really interacting with equal partners with whom we have close economic ties. The last period, in fact, of significant great power competition was 1890 to 1939, and the United States was relatively uninvolved in that competitive environment because we chose a policy of isolation or of regional focus, with the exception of the First World War. So the United States, although intellectually we can accept that great power competition is normal, it's just very unusual in all of our individual experiences. We're used to leading the international system and not being challenged. And so the emergence of a competitor, the emergence of a state that is going to be economically and financially our equal and perhaps even greater at some point in the future, is a very disturbing thought. And that does lead to the idea that we are now going to be going into a new Cold War. This is aided by the fact that China is run by a communist government. the People's Republic of China and the Chinese Communist Party, makes us think about the Cold War as the natural analogy for US-China competition. There are similarities and there are important ones, but at the same time, I think actually we're entering a very different international environment, and that the Cold War is not the best metaphor, historically or politically, for us to think about in terms of the emerging competition. First off, the Soviet Union voluntarily removed itself from the emerging global economy. It sought autarky, socialism under one state, and then later autarky within the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet bloc. China, on the other hand, is a critical element in a developed global economy. To remove China from the global economy will remove somewhere between 15 and 20% of the global economy. And that will hurt not only the United States, which is heavily invested as a trading partner, but also many other countries around the world. So China's economic position means that things we took for granted in the Cold War, that we could economically contain the Soviet Union, simply are not viable in the modern era. The Soviet-US competition was played out between proxies and coalition partners to a great extent. There were wars in the periphery between partners of the Soviet Union and partners of the United States. We don't see that happening yet. And in fact, one of the most important elements of this competition is that China has relatively few allies. Now, that doesn't mean that it doesn't have a lot of international influence, but it has relatively few allies. Its closest political allies in the world are Pakistan and North Korea. And those are countries that face significant challenges in their own right. And Pakistan is consistently trying to be a partner of the US as well. So that suggests that the idea that China will be able to wield proxies and allies in the way that the Soviet Union did, at least at this point, is very unlikely. Also very important, the US conceded Soviet spheres of influence that were distant and economically and politically relatively unimportant to the United States, at the time Eastern Europe. And then we contested other areas where the Soviets were trying to expand a sphere of influence, like the Middle East and the Persian Gulf. Right now, the core areas of contestation with China, we are not going to concede a sphere of influence. The South China Sea, the East China Sea, those are areas that are of critical importance to the international economy and to maritime trade. And those are areas where we are very unlikely to concede to China that that is your zone. The nuclear balance is much more lopsided than in the Cold War. Although China has the capacity to build up a much more substantive nuclear arsenal, the element of the arms race right now is much more subdued and much more peripheral to the relationship than it was to the relationship between the US and the Soviet Union. Last but not least, and this is something that we can discuss in the Q&A, but it's something we should constantly keep in mind. The reason that we had a competition with the Soviet Union that frequently flared into confrontation and proxy war was because the Soviet Union's objectives, we felt, were global and very radical and almost existential in terms of the threat to US interests. The idea of a capitalist Western democratic bloc against a communist Soviet bloc made the competition very stark. The Soviet Union wanted the whole world to be communist, and it had the capacity, perhaps, to make that happen through force. And that made this competition a very stark one. China's objectives, I think we need to look at more carefully because they may be relatively more limited. We'll talk about that in a moment. A better historical parallel, I would argue, is the period from 1870 to 1914, when there's a significant shift in the international system. Britain goes into a relative decline from being the leading industrial nation as other nations begin to industrialize and catch up. This is also a period where you have the emergence of new great powers. Germany, which was very powerful, Italy and Japan, which were still great powers that could exhibit enormous influence in particular regions, but were much smaller than some of the largest powers. And you also see the stagnation and decline of older great powers and the emergence of both Germany and the United States as potential long-term competitors with Great Britain. Now, to some extent, this period ended tragically because the Anglo-German competition turned into a major war that reshaped the map of Europe. On the left, you see the map of Europe in 1914, and on the right, you see what it looked like in 1919. On the other hand, in this period also, the British managed to transition with the United States from 1914 until 1945 in a much more positive way that allowed Britain to maintain a role in a changing international system that was eventually led by the United States for reasons of both military and economic power. There are good things to study in this period, and I would point out both Chinese and American analysts and politicians are studying this period fairly intensely. Now, at the Naval War College, we study a number of different great power competitions. We study the Peloponnesian War between Sparta and Athens. We study a series of wars between France and the United Kingdom that last from about 1688 until about 1815. We study competition between Germany and the United Kingdom from 1870 to 1945, between Germany and the US from 1917 to 1945, and of course the Cold War. Now, there are some things that we can learn from studying these great power competitions. Two factors are particularly critical. The first is coalitions and alliances, and the second is economics. There are some other issues that we can also determine. Change in the international system isn't always driven by ambition or particular actions by one great power or another. Sometimes it's driven by external factors. And because of this, leadership matters a great deal. And last but not least, in all of these great power competitions, we see episodes of war and peace. There may be long periods of peace that then are broken by war as the competitors move towards confrontations over issues of important interests. And most importantly, we learn that great power wars are very, very costly indeed. Now, we usually look at great power competitions in terms of revisionists and status quo powers. And revisionist powers include states like Napoleonic France. According to Sparta, Athens was a revisionist power. According to the rest of the world, Nazi Germany was a revisionist power. The Soviet Union was a revisionist power. There are people who think the United States is a revisionist power when we sometimes go and declare that we are going to promote democracy around the world. But revisionists usually have a positive aim, a fairly aggressive purpose. They want to change the system entirely, or they may want to change the leadership of the system or their place in the system, or at a sort of limited end, they may want to acquire territory or a sphere of influence. Status quo powers, on the other hand, want to defend what exists, or as much of what exists as possible. They may want to maintain leadership of the system if they're the system leader. They may want to manage system transition if other great powers are surpassing them or threatening to surpass them. They may want to manage decline, maintain their territory or status, or sometimes even just restore the balance of power. The most dangerous of these revisionist powers, the one that sticks in our minds the most in many ways, is of course Nazi Germany, which almost conquered Europe successfully in the period from 1935 to 1941. And a united Europe opposing any other coalition of great powers would have been an extremely difficult thing to defeat. So often when we look at revisionist powers, we immediately think, well, they're probably like the Nazis. And it's easier to do this when they also have totalitarian regimes, which we did with Iraq. We did to a certain extent with Serbia, even though it's a much smaller state. And some are inclined to do with China. Certainly some of the things that China is carrying out in Xinjiang are very reminiscent of some of the things that the Nazis did. Genocide, forced sterilization, a whole series of other things, forced labor, among other things. But it's worth making sure that we realize that not all revisionist powers are the Nazis. Going back to key points, the stronger coalition usually wins. Sparta defeated Athens by allying with Persia. Britain faced its most dire situations when it didn't have allies. But for most of the period where it was the leading power, it successfully maintained coalitions and alliances. The Axis famously in 1941, in a vastly superior position, failed to cooperate and coordinate their strategies, and as a result, lost any chance of defeating the Allies. And the Western coalition was fundamentally stronger than the Soviet bloc in the Cold War. Economics matter a great deal, but it's important to recognize that economics are not necessarily zero-sum. If I am, as a state, am not as economically strong as my adversary, I may be able to make alliances that will increase my overall economic power. Athens, the more powerful economic state, lost the Second Peloponnesian War and was almost annihilated as a result. Britain lost the American Revolution, despite being much wealthier than France. Germany squandered its potential economic superiority, and the Soviet Union squandered a great deal of its economic potential. So on the economic front, there's enormous value in both prudence, in using your own resources, and also in diplomacy, in acquiring allies and partners who can extend your resources. I talked about system transition. Some of the externalities that can change a system and cause crises that then move states from competition to confrontation or war include the collapse of international norms of traditions. We usually talk about these in terms of revolutions, the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, the Iranian Revolution. We also see power transition happen from external factors, military revolutions, where some states become radically more powerful militarily because they adapt existing technology into military organizations in ways that make their militaries much more tactically or operationally effective. We also see economic revolutions primarily driven by new technologies in which states leapfrog or climb up the ladder of competitiveness and become much more economically powerful than they had been in the past. And finally, we can see economic disruption, especially in the 20th century, leads to political tension, which in turn may lead to conflict, or at least to greater confrontation in great power competitions. The Great Depressions of 1929 to 1938, the oil crisis in the 1970s, and then more recently, the economic crises of 1997, 2008, and 2020 have had profound effects on the international system. This is one of the reasons leaders matter. Leaders can then manage their countries in times of change. And great leaders may be able to manage those times of change much more effectively and with a better long-term vision than weaker leaders. And things like the reputation of leaders, their trustworthiness, how honest they are with themselves and their people, and especially whether they're reckless or prudent, may make a great deal of difference in terms of managing great power competitions, managing those externalities, and preventing a system from moving from peace towards war. Some key concepts in competition, therefore, that leaders have to make judgments of are distinguishing between existential and lesser threats. Are the Senkaku Islands an existential threat to the United States? Or are they a lesser but still significant threat? Because that may very much change how we look at a threat in that region. Israel, for instance, often looks at threats as existential because it's very small and it's surrounded by states that in the past have been hostile. The United States has a much greater security buffer. Building and maintaining effective coalitions and managing economic competitiveness are critical for leaders in great power competition in order to sustain our position and profit as much as we can in that competition. Sustaining public support, avoiding overextension, managing risk, and avoiding escalation if you're caught in confrontations or other conflicts. And most importantly, understanding the consequences of war. I'm going to talk about that very briefly at here at the end now. What starts great power wars? Well, they generally tend to be either wars of choice or wars of response or reaction. Now, a war of response or reaction isn't necessarily a defensive war. It's responding to something that's happening somewhere else. Wars of choice often are driven by a perception of existential threat or of inevitable war. Sometimes they're driven by a window of opportunity or vulnerability, the idea that now is a unique opportunity for us to gain advantage against our adversary because of some particular circumstance. And they're driven by domestic politics. Again, and it's the domestic politics, which is a place where leaders matter a great deal in terms of managing. Wars of response may be responding to escalation from a conflict somewhere else. They may be supporting an ally or some kind of entangling commitment. They may be driven by the action of other parties because other parties have agency. And as we think about great power competition, it's worth pointing out that this is not just China and Russia. The EU, even after Brexit, is a very significant great power in a lot of ways in the international system. Japan certainly is a great power, even if it has chosen to limit its military capability and foreign policy in some ways. India is an emerging great power, and their actions may create a war of response or reaction on the part of the United States or China. Great power wars, once they're begun, we know they tend to be protracted. And when they're done in the context of a long-term competition, they tend to be fought in multiple rounds. As Clausewitz says, in war, the result is rarely ever final. And many great power wars end in stalemate and then a protracted period of peace as both sides gear up for a potential second round. And in that second round, aims may be more extreme because both sides have been stalemated and therefore frustrated and may feel that they have to be much more committed and much more violent in order to secure their aims the next time. Great power wars also escalate horizontally, the geographic spread with the creation of coalitions. So great power wars tend to go global or extra-regional very quickly. They escalate vertically in intensity. Once you start fighting, the combination of sunk cost fallacy and the desire not to negotiate from an inferior position mean that fighting intensity tends to mount very rapidly, and they tend to escalate rhetorically and ideologically, especially in those second tries. An example of that is the distinction between the foreign policy and strategic approach of the Kaiser and of Nazi Germany. A decision for war, going back to Clausewitz, who we study intensely, you shouldn't go to war unless you know what you want to achieve and how you intend to conduct it. And as Machiavelli tells us, anyone can start a war when he wants to, but not finish it. To finish it requires the support in some ways of your adversary. And this is a reason that great power competitions, when they turned to war, become extremely costly. Thinking about war termination is a critical part of planning for deterrence and of understanding the consequences of war. What is it you're really fighting for? What's the political objective and its relative value to you and to your adversary? Does it mean your adversary values it more than you do and therefore will fight harder? If you're defending the status quo, what elements of the status quo are critical? This, for instance, plays out in very interesting ways in the Cold War, in containment. George Kennan, who wrote the X telegram, or the X article and the long telegram, Kennan's concept of containing the Soviet Union was there were 5 critical areas that were industrial areas in the world in the late 1940s. The United States, the Soviet Union, Great Britain, the Ruhr Valley of Germany, and Japan. And if the objective of containment was to maintain control of 4 out of the 5 of those, because if the Soviets did not get one of those big industrial areas, they would not be able to compete in the long run. On the other hand, this left China vulnerable. And when China, in the Chinese Civil War, became communist and an ally of the Soviet Union, it completely disrupted concepts of containment and made us think of them in very different ways. Right? So what elements are critical in the status quo is very important. If you are at war, do you need to fight to the bitter end or can you negotiate a settlement? What outcomes realistic and how do you define victory or at least an acceptable end? It may be that in war, a strategic pause is a significant success, and an unsatisfactory settlement may be better than protracted war, because a protracted war between the US and China will wreck the global economy. What concessions are you willing to make to achieve peace early if you're going to avoid escalation? And most importantly, is time on your side in this war or in peacetime? Whose side is time on? There are many who assume that it's on China's side because of China's mass and because of its rapid growth over the past 30 years, which has really been quite remarkable. Michael Beckley's book, which I mentioned earlier, looks inside China's social conditions a bit more and explains why China may not be able to sustain growth in that kind of way and may have increasing domestic pressure for resources that would limit its power elsewhere. How do great power wars end? Negotiation, which is often brought around by stalemate, by an internal political shift on one side, by economic exhaustion on one side, which is a negative consequence if you're exhausted, by a rational calculus that the cost exceeds the benefits, or by military exhaustion on both sides. Again, very expensive proposition. Sometimes they will end in an imposed peace. This usually happens because of a catastrophe. Regime collapse, social upheaval, military exhaustion on one side, basically the destruction of one of the competitors. That is extraordinarily costly and extraordinarily damaging to the international system, especially when both states are major players in the global economy. So the risks of great power war, as we think about competition, is that they have costs and consequences that are always unanticipated. They tend to cost much more than anyone could imagine. They can threaten, undermine, or even overturn the existing international economic system that one side wants to defend. And since for the United States, our objective is to maintain as much control and influence over the international system that we have basically designed as possible, that means we should be very, very careful about thinking about war. Even wars with non-great powers can escalate, inviting intervention by the other side or becoming protracted problems. And so in the end result, we have to consider that managing competition is far preferable to fighting great power war. And managing requires not only military forces to deter, but more effective diplomatic and economic interactions. And of course, this is even exacerbated more by the role of nuclear weapons. Since both sides have nuclear weapons, great power war becomes very, very dangerous right away. And that's important to remember. So how does this apply to the future? One of the most important political objectives for the US and other will be to maintain as much control over the international system as possible without resorting to war. War in this great power competition will be a failure of policy. And that's important to recognize. Thinking about how to avoid war, how to deter war in critical places is going to be a very difficult series of choices for the United States in an era of resource constraints post-COVID. Limiting and winning wars still requires serious thought and analysis in order to make sure that you have an adequate deterrent against reckless enemy behavior. And the concepts and tools of strategy and the lessons of history are applicable to great power competition, both in peace and in war. And to go back to the Thucydides trap and the Thucydides dilemma, Pericles himself, the leader of Athens, said, "Indeed, I am more afraid of our own blunders than of the enemy's devices." And in the course of a 30-year war, which was actually in some ways a competition, two separate phases of fighting broken by an extended truce, Athens managed to squander all of its advantages and end up helpless in the face of a Spartan and Persian alliance that would have been unthinkable 2 generations earlier. In that same way, as we think of competition, although we have to think about the military components, we also have to think very carefully about economic and diplomatic tools. Because again, if the winners of great power competition tend to be the ones that maintain the best coalitions and the greatest economic influence, then having partners and allies, great and small, will be critical for the United States to maintain as much leverage as possible over this competition as it unfolds. And with that, I will take any questions that you might have. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you, Dr. Hoyt, for that presentation. Always a pleasure listening to you speak. Ladies and gentlemen, I am mindful of time, but we do have about 20 minutes available for Q&A. As a reminder, please remain on mute, but should you have a question to ask, please submit it through the Q&A box, and I will try to get to them in the order that they were received, of course, time permitting. I know the first question, and I share with you, Dr. Hoyt, and I know you've already kind of let us know that before the presentation, is will the slides be available for us to download? So I know you already indicated you'd share them with me, and I know Shannon, my director of communications, will have them posted on our webpage for subsequent download should somebody want to refer to them later.
Yeah.
So thank you for that, Professor.
Absolutely, I'd be delighted. And when I send them to George, I will include on the first slide my email address, so that if you have any questions or ideas come up to you after this session, you can just email me and I'll be glad to answer them.
Awesome. Thank you very much. The next question is from Shelley Garrett. How does China's changing understanding of its role in the Second World War, as described in Rana Mitter's China's Good War, affect China's view versus the United States? China seems to be developing its narrative of World War II, just as the US, Britain, and the USSR have their own narrative.
That's a really interesting question, and it probably has two sides to it. The first is it's natural for states to develop a narrative about a war that is reaffirming of the state itself. And again, we have in the U.S. we refer to the Greatest Generation, right? I mean, that's talk about the mobilization of the country, and it was our fight against evil. These things are true, but they're also, depending on how you highlight them, they're also very self-affirming, right? They make us feel good about fighting that war, even though some of the things that we did caused a lot of loss of life in a lot of parts of the world. China's beginning to do that, which is again, probably signifies their own self-image of their role in the world, because the Second World War was so pivotal. Claiming a greater share in that war is probably very self-affirming. I think it's also going to be very interesting because the role that the Chinese Communist Party played in that war, in the Sino-Japanese War, was actually fairly modest. But the way in which it's being portrayed undoubtedly will highlight much more the role of the Chinese Communist Party and very much downplay the role of the existing government at the time, the Kuomintang. So it will be, as the story develops, it will be built to some extent upon a lie. But it's not clear how much that lie can be exposed in China at this time, both because of the government of Xi, who is hearkening back to Mao Zedong very much in terms of his rhetoric and in terms of his personal stature within the party and the country, but also because the facts simply aren't available. And again, information is tightly controlled. So there may be information that would contradict this new emerging Chinese story, but it may not be available to the Chinese public, which again creates an interesting situation, perhaps an opportunity for information operations, but also, when you build your own history in a vacuum, it may mean that your history becomes both inaccurate and eventually disappointing in some way. Does that answer your question?
It sounds like it.
Okay.
I hope it did. Shelley, please give me a follow-up if not.
Yeah, if not, please follow up by email later. I'd be glad to talk about it more.
Yeah, thank you. The next question is from Michael Jefferson. Can an established power versus a rising power equation be disrupted by a new rising power? This new rising power draining resources and influence from the first rising power, and thus keeping the first rising power from achieving a necessary critical mass of influence or power to fully challenge the established power?
That's a really interesting question. I think it's not clear that we have historical examples that would exactly meet the question you posed. But I would say the situation that Britain faced in the late 19th century was a very unusual one because at the time, lots of great powers were building new navies, which raised sort of the overall threat level for Britain to manage in terms of dominating the seas. But two powers in particular were emerging at the same time. And they posed very different kinds of challenges. One was the United States, which was an ocean away, and the other was Germany, which was a sea away. And the rise of both simultaneously required the British to do some fairly deft diplomatic maneuvering in order not to have to face both. Lest we forget, in 1914, about 50% of the population of the United States was descended either from Ireland or from Germany. And there were substantial portions of the US population from 1914 until 1916, at a minimum, that actually were very sympathetic to Imperial Germany in the First World War. So Britain had to manage the American problem very deftly in order to concentrate its resources against the German problem. And in this case, Britain did it fairly successfully. There were still tensions between the United States and Britain, tensions over neutrality laws at the beginning of the First World War, and then the United States became an isolationist state again in 1920. The US Navy and the Royal Navy planned against one another just in case throughout portions of the interwar years. So this was not a cozy relationship, but the British managed it well enough that when a second crisis came, they could rely on US support. So that's an example of using tools that are not simply military to try and deal with the problem. The British tried to deal with the German problem diplomatically, but were unable to. So there's no perfect solution, but one can see the rise of simultaneous powers and manage them differently. And I think, in fact, you could say that the United States is trying to do that right now, not so much with China and Russia, but with China and India. The United States policy with India is an attempt to accommodate India's emergence as a great power in as many ways as we possibly can, because we don't see a lot of competing interests with India, and we see more with China. So we are focused on China as a potential competitor and tend to look at India as a potential partner. That brings up policy problems, but we're managing them fairly well so far. And since I do a lot of work on India, I can say our relationship with India is better than I ever thought it would be in my lifetime. And that's the result of hard work of several administrations.
Wow, very good. A terrific answer. Next question is from Paul Sherbo. What red lines or existential threats, if crossed by China, would make the U.S. more confrontational? And what red lines crossed by the U.S. would make China more confrontational? Do both sides know each other's red lines?
That's a really good question. And I would say we probably don't, for the most part. I would suggest that there are probably two places where both China and the US look at with considerable caution and alarm as places that might be that flashpoint for war. And one of those places is North Korea, and the second place is Taiwan. It's not clear to me that for either state, either of those places should be the red line, but each looks at those places as hypersensitive in one way or another. And I think a lot of scenario building about a possible US-China war probably looks at one of those two places as the potential flashpoint. And Obviously, Taiwan is incredibly sensitive, and obviously North Korea is very unpredictable. So it's understandable why they, while I may not be formal red lines, are viewed as flashpoints. That doesn't
No,
entirely answer your question, but it's the best I can do right now.
no, yeah, no. I mean, it's kind of interesting. I mean, it would be insightful to have. I mean, typically, when you say great power competition, and you alluded to this in your presentation, it's U.S. versus some other great power. But you know, what kind of research is there, perhaps proof that other great, that there is a strategy of great power competition that is a view of other great powers, and how do they view it amongst themselves, or is it just a phrase that's coined by the U.S. that's adopted worldwide, and that generates this ongoing dialogue and different things like red lines and political, economic, and military power, and how do you advance that?
Yeah.
It's just kind of interesting. I don't know if there's a virtual presentation going on somewhere in the world right now with North Korea, China, Russia, or whatnot, that are having these similar conversations. It's interesting.
Yeah.
From Victor Sussman, you mentioned that the stronger coalition usually wins. In the near term, China seems poised to be economically stronger, but not yet part of a coalition. Are there any relevant examples where a less mature coalition prevails in great power competition?
A less mature coalition. Well, I think again, the 1870 to 1914 period is a fruitful place to look for the emergence of a number of great powers in a globalized economy, in a globalizing economy. There are, as Mark Twain said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. There are many rhymes to be found there. Germany became strong enough with its with carrying weak allies in Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire to successfully take on an alliance of Britain, France, and Russia, which was a slightly stronger economic alliance, but not by much. And since Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire didn't contribute that much to the main theaters of the war, one could make the argument that Germany successfully took on that alliance and eventually defeated Russia, which is one of those unusual circumstances in history. Russia usually doesn't get beaten. Russia may choose to withdraw from a war, but it's a really big country and it's really strong. So the fact that it had a social collapse meant that Germany actually effectively defeated a stronger economic coalition that again was a fairly new one, right? The Triple Entente was formed in 1907. And it was formed by countries that had been hostile to one another in the past, Britain, France, and Russia. Now, the Germans were foolish enough to defeat Russia and then immediately force the United States into the war, which then increased the economic power of the coalition and brought new resources in, which led to German defeat. But if it had not brought the United States into the war, 1917 might have been a pivotal year in which the Allies would have found themselves looking at a very difficult situation where they had lost a very important ally, and not knowing what was going on in the German economy at the time, they might have been tempted to think about negotiations in 1918. I'm sure we could do a much more sophisticated analysis of that, but in terms of a single emerging power breaking an economic coalition, that might be an example of one.
Excellent. We've got about 6 minutes left. From Bill Peterson, any thoughts on Stratcom's recent comments re being prepared for nuclear war?
Well, I'm a little too young to remember diving under the desk at elementary school, but I do remember the bomb shelter in the basement. Professional militaries have to think about nuclear war, not to do so as an abrogation of their responsibility. Thinking about nuclear war is important to enhance deterrence. I would assume that Stratcom and the militaries of the United States and of other nuclear powers are frequently thinking about preparing for nuclear war. In terms of preparing our society for nuclear war, I think we found in the Cold War that that was incredibly difficult, and to do it in any meaningful way was incredibly expensive. And I don't think politically that we'll move very far in that direction under either party. I think instead the fallback position would probably be more money for ballistic missile defense, which has sort of taken the place of preparing society for the consequences of nuclear war since the late Cold War. However, we should be thinking about nuclear war and its effects, not just because of China, but also, again, because of North Korea, because of Pakistan, because of India, possibly the United Arab Emirates at some point in the future, or Saudi Arabia, or Iran. Nuclear proliferation is a reality, and we probably need to think about the possibility of nuclear use in ways other than the way we used to think about it in the Cold War, simply because there are so many other players now.
No, that's fair. Obviously, it's a big deterrence component as well as far as influence, but I understand. From William Stiegel Jr., why are we in Afghanistan if they are not a great power?
In the last 20 years, we were not viewing the world in terms of great power competition. And I will say that at the Naval War College, we began making some shifts after around 2006 or 2007, where the curriculum started looking more at the possibility of renewed great power competition, simply because we were looking at the international system and seeing some fundamental changes, not only the rise of Chinese economic power, but also changes in Chinese behavior and changes in Russian behavior in Ukraine, in Georgia, in the Crimea. So Afghanistan is the last remnant, or one of the last significant remnants of a 20-year period, which we could never find the right name for, but the global war on terror probably encapsulates it. And one of the reasons that we may be getting out of Afghanistan is simply because we are refocusing on a different perspective on threats to international security. The Obama administration attempted to pivot to Asia, but as members of the Obama administration have commented, even after the pivot to Asia, something like 80% of the National Security Council meetings still tended to be on things going on in the Middle East, because that was the war we were currently fighting. Getting out of Afghanistan will contribute significantly to ending that war. And we'll see if it happens in September. I know that the president has made that statement. We have wanted to withdraw before and found that we were unable. So we'll see what happens after the fighting season is over.
Well, thank you, Dr. Hoyt. We'll cut it off there. There are several questions yet, so I think Shannon, we might be able to tee them up for you and send them to you separately.
Absolutely.
And perhaps you could respond to them via email. But,
absolutely, I'd be delighted.
It was really truly an honor to host you this evening and to speak about a very interesting and relevant topic. And we appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to spend it with us this evening. We look forward to getting you back again soon. And thank you again.
Always. And again, thank you to the foundation for all your efforts and all that you do for the college. We really do appreciate it.
Our pleasure. Thanks. Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes tonight's presentation. Thank you again for joining us. And please join us on May 19th for a presentation by Dr. Paul Smith, who will speak to guests about the tragedy of U.S.-China relations overcoming the fourth phase. Updates on this topic and others are posted on the Foundation's website at nwcfoundation.org. And be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube. The Naval War College Foundation is working hard to expand its membership and raise awareness of the U.S. Naval War College, and we appreciate your continued support and advocacy. Have a great rest of your evening. Stay well, and thank you again for joining us tonight. Bye-bye.